Harmless pranks are usually forgotten within minutes, but some turn deadly when panic, misjudgment, or misplaced confidence collide with unforgiving terrain. These stories show how quickly a joke can escalate into tragedy. Here are 6 of the most tragic prank-turned fatalities caused by their own actions. It was June 9, 2022, at a small desert campground near the edge of the Mojave. Evening wind carried dust lightly between the sites as temperatures dropped. Families settled into their shelters for the night, while lanterns glowed through nylon walls, and the last conversations of the day drifted across the quiet loop. Jordan West, 7, and his sister Emily, 10, were camping with their parents for a weekend trip. Their tent sat near the center of the loop among several other family sites. Earlier in the day, a group of boys from a nearby campsite had been playing with novelty smoke firecrackers, setting them off on gravel paths where the smoke drifted harmlessly in the open air. As darkness set in, the boys lingered near their remaining firecrackers. According to other campers, they had discussed using the remaining firecrackers to bother children who were already inside their tents. They had placed unlit ones near other shelters earlier, creating momentary confusion without injury. Jordan and Emily's tent was partially zipped, and movement inside caught their attention. 2 lit firecrackers were slid beneath an outer panel near the ground. The boys appeared to expect only a brief puff of smoke. As the device slid under the flap, the burning fuse tip became pinned directly against the nylon, allowing the small flame to remain in contact long enough to ignite the synthetic fabric. Nylon camping tents can ignite quickly once exposed to sustained heat, and as the lower section burned, the structure began to collapse inward. Witness accounts varied. Some campers recalled hearing a sharp sound, while others noticed flickering light through the fabric, but assumed someone was using a lantern. Only when the flames intensified did people realize a tent was burning. By then, the lower half had already folded inward, filling the interior with dense smoke from melting synthetic fabric. The Wests ran toward the site after hearing shouting. At first, they could not tell which tent was involved, and several seconds passed before they recognized their own. Attempts to open the tent were slowed by heat, confusion, and limited visibility. People nearby tried pulling the collapsing material apart, but the structure continued to sag as the fire spread along the base. When the tent was finally opened enough to reach the interior, Jordan and Emily were pulled out. They were moved away from the flames while others tried to extinguish burning sections using water bottles and coolers. Emergency services were notified, though response time was slowed by the campground's remote location and difficulty accessing the loop. Both children were transported for medical care. Medical personnel later reported injuries consistent with smoke inhalation and exposure to a rapid tent fire, though the exact progression of events could not be determined. The timeline of when each child succumbed to the conditions remained unclear. The fire destroyed much of the physical evidence. Investigators found only charred tent material, partially burned objects, and the remains of several fireworks near the site. Because so much had been consumed, they could not identify the precise point of ignition. The boys involved were described as distressed and unable to give clear or consistent accounts, and questioning was limited due to their age and the presence of their parents. Investigators eventually determined only that fireworks had been used near the tent and ignited it, but many details about the exact sequence remained unknown. The incident was classified as a fatal accident resulting from a prank that unintentionally caused a rapidly spreading tent fire. It was April 19, 2019, in a small commercial strip outside Clarkston, Georgia. Overhead lamps cast uneven shadows across the pavement, and thin layers of pollen shifted along the lot each time a vehicle passed. The evening appeared routine until a series of avoidable decisions aligned within seconds. Jared Whitcomb, 22, arrived at the lot with his friends Lucas Marin and Chase Dorn. They regularly filmed short public reaction videos and improvised scenes, usually without structured planning. The group selected this area because the open rows of parking spaces and steady foot movement made it easier to record spontaneous responses. Their equipment included a handheld camera, lightweight masks, and 2 black imitation knives made of rigid polymer. The polymer knives were molded to resemble real blades, and in the dim center lot lighting, they were indistinguishable from actual knives. Environmental conditions contributed to what followed. The brightest lights were positioned near the storefronts, leaving the center of the lot in partial shadow. Reflections from windshields distorted outlines and made it difficult to distinguish fine details at a distance. Several witnesses later reported that they could see movement clearly, but could not identify the material or texture of objects being held. According to statements from Lucas and Chase, Jared walked ahead first, wearing a mask and carrying one of the imitation knives along his right leg. They stayed several yards behind him to capture the approach on camera. At the same time, a 56-year-old man named Ronald Beach finished loading groceries into his truck and stepped away from the driver's door. When he turned toward the lot, he saw Jared moving directly across an open pavement toward him. Witnesses placed the distance at less than 20 feet. Investigators reconstructed the next moments through security footage, physical evidence, and witness accounts. Jared took several quick steps toward the walkway, maintaining a straight line of movement toward Ronald. Ronald drew a legally owned handgun from his waistband and fired a single round. Jared collapsed immediately, striking the pavement near the painted boundary of a parking space. Lucas and Chase retreated toward their vehicle and did not approach him. Blood pattern analysis showed curved arcs at the point of collapse consistent with a forward fall. A shallow smear 2 feet from where he landed indicated only slight movement after impact. The imitation knife was found near his right hand, and the mask had shifted partially off his face during the fall. The camera had been dropped earlier and was later recovered about 15 feet behind the filming position. It continued recording, but captured only angled pavement and ambient sound. Local rescue teams arrived within minutes. They assessed Jared on the pavement and transported him to a medical facility, where he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The official cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the chest. Forensic reviews showed residue patterns consistent with an intermediate range shot, which aligned with the distance witnesses described. Responders collected the imitation knife, the mask, and the recording device, which contained partial footage of the staging process. No functional weapons were recovered from Jared. Investigators concluded that Ronald reacted to what he believed was an imminent threat, influenced by lighting conditions and the appearance of the polymer blade. The final determination categorized the event as an accidental death resulting from misidentification during an unannounced stage scenario. It was September 3rd, 2021, in a remote climbing area known locally as Red Butte Pinnacle in northeastern Wyoming. Temperatures held at 52 degrees under low clouds, and steady southwest winds swept across the open meadow. The incoming system kept most climbers away, leaving the east side routes unusually quiet. Red Butte's primary ascent line followed a traditional crack system up a narrow volcanic pillar. The multi-pitch route required consistent technique, stable weather, and a leader capable of managing transitions across several ledges. Local instructors rated it suitable for intermediate climbers with reliable equipment and prior multi-pitch experience. Ethan Lau, 24, had driven to the site with 3 friends for a weekend climb. Ethan was the most technically experienced in the group, having completed several comparable multi-pitch routes in the region. His companions, Rob Ellis, Daniel Holt, and Chris Mendez, mostly climbed at indoor gyms and had limited practice outdoors. In preparation for the trip, Ethan spent several weeks reviewing anchor building, rope handling, and communication protocols with them. The group reached the trailhead at 2:45 p.m. Ethan laid out his gear in a methodical pattern, checking cams, ropes, helmets, and his personal harness, a well-maintained model he had used for the past year. The others organized their equipment beside him as the weather began to shift. Later that night, while Ethan slept, Rob and Daniel decided to play a prank. At approximately 11:40 p.m., they removed Ethan's harness from his gear pile and hid it in their vehicle, intending to reveal the joke during the morning pack-up. Based on later interviews, neither had considered the impact the missing harness might have on the climb's preparation window. The group woke before sunrise on September 4th. Ethan began his standard pre-climb check at 6:10 a.m., but could not find his harness after searching through every gear bag. After 20 minutes, Daniel offered his spare harness, a second-hand model he had purchased cheaply earlier that summer. Investigators later documented internal webbing and stitch degradation in the waist belt area, the kind that can weaken over years, yet remain difficult to detect during a routine visual check. Ethan adjusted the buckles to their tightest settings, but the fit remained slightly loose around his waist. With the weather moving in, the group began the approach at 6:50 a.m. At 7:25 a.m., Ethan started leading the first pitch. The initial section followed a clean crack, but transitioned into a leaning traverse, requiring him to sit back onto the harness while placing protection. According to witness statements, Ethan paused briefly at the traverse and appeared to test his position before fully weighing the harness. At roughly 80 feet above the ground, the waist belt webbing failed under load, causing the harness to open along the damaged section and releasing Ethan from the rope system. He fell backward away from the wall, dropping an estimated 70 feet before striking a lower ledge and then rolling onto the talus field. The group activated their satellite communicator at 7:32 a.m. Local search and rescue personnel reached the base at 8:20 a.m. and assessed Ethan, who showed no signs of life. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation confirmed that the spare harness had significant structural deterioration, especially along the waist belt stitching. Ethan's own harness, recovered from the vehicle, remained in serviceable condition. Interviews established that the missing harness had originated as a prank and that the group had no knowledge of the spare harness's compromised integrity. 2 members later faced charges related to reckless endangerment. Ethan Lau's death demonstrated how tampering with essential safety equipment can turn a routine climb into a fatal event when worn or unreliable gear replaces dependable protection. It was June 6th, 2021, in a 2-story home outside Fayetteville, North Carolina. Warm air drifted through the open back door as guests moved between the yard and the kitchen. Folding tables, balloons, and a tall layered cake on the island marked the early evening birthday gathering already underway. Gene Wilson, 18, had invited several classmates from his senior year social circle, including 17-year-old Kurt Lewis, who was known within the group for occasional light pranks at gatherings and school events. Jean often hosted small celebrations at his home because his family had space for outdoor activities, and his classmates were familiar with the layout of the kitchen and adjoining yard. The cake at the center of the island was a tall, multi-layered structure prepared by a local home baker for the occasion. Rigid, food-safe plastic dowels were positioned vertically inside the cake to stabilize the stacked tiers, though none of the guests appeared aware that internal supports were present. Shortly before sunset, the group closed in around the island to record the singing. Several guests crowded close behind Jean, limiting available movement and leaving little clearance between the island and surrounding bodies. He leaned toward the candles, while others raised their phones, narrowing the physical space further. Investigators later reconstructed the next sequence using video recordings, injury measurements, and material evidence from the cake. When the singing ended, Kurt placed a hand behind Gene's shoulder and gave him a quick, firm shove intended as a joke, aiming to push his face lightly into the cake. Gene was already leaning toward the candles, and guests were packed closely behind him, leaving little room to step back or brace. The impact compressed the tall, multi-tier cake downward and exposed the upper ends of 2 rigid, food-grade plastic dowels used to stabilize the layers. One dowel penetrated just below Gene's right eye, traveling downward at a slight angle. The combined effect of the focused forward momentum and the dowel's rigidity produced a deep puncture extending into the orbital region. The second dowel scraped across the cheek, producing a long, superficial tear. Cake fragments on the counter displayed a clear, narrow channel consistent with the primary puncture path. John attempted to pull backward reflexively, but the position of the dowel and the limited available space caused additional tissue damage as he fell sideways against the island. Blood patterns on the countertop and floor showed a rapid onset of external bleeding. Several guests stepped away, and one recording device captured the moment he collapsed after slipping against frosting and icing debris. A family member guided him to the floor and attempted to maintain pressure on the wound using folded towels. The puncture site displayed heavy external bleeding from damaged facial vessels, and John lost responsiveness within minutes. Local rescue teams arrived after a call from the backyard and initiated emergency measures. he was transported to a medical facility under assisted ventilation. Medical documentation confirmed a penetrating facial and orbital injury with associated vascular damage. Imaging showed the rod had entered the orbital cavity and caused significant vascular injury, leading to rapid blood loss. Despite intervention attempts, Jeanne was pronounced dead shortly after arrival due to acute blood loss and traumatic injury to the surrounding structures. Responders collected the plastic dowels, sections of cake, and photographs of the impact area. Measurements from the dowels matched the depth, angle, and spacing of Jeanne's injuries. Analysis of the cake layers confirmed that the dessert had been made by a local home baker using standard tier stabilizing dowels, which are commonly placed inside tall layered cakes to prevent structural collapse. The dowels were fully concealed beneath frosting and interior layers, leaving no outward indication of their presence to guests. Kurt provided a statement acknowledging that he initiated the shove without knowledge of the internal supports. Investigators concluded that the death resulted from an unintended interaction between the prank-induced forward force and the concealed stabilization dowels inside the cake. The incident was classified as accidental, caused by misjudged proximity, limited spatial clearance, and a lack of awareness of the cake's internal structure. It was November 8, 2019, in a remote section of Central Oregon, where a narrow two-lane road wound through forested hills. Evening temperatures hovered at 34 degrees, and patches of early frost formed across shaded asphalt as light winds moved through the trees. Rachel Martinez, 23, was driving home after finishing a late shift at a small local clinic. Co-workers later stated she typically drove cautiously on rural roads and followed the same route each evening. Device records showed she began her trip at 9:15 p.m., traveling through an area known for limited cell service and sharp curves. Investigators later documented that her friend, 25-year-old Tyler Ruiz, had left the clinic earlier that night. Interviews with acquaintances and phone data confirmed that Tyler had a pattern of making lighthearted prank calls involving fabricated emergencies. These calls were usually directed at close friends, and Rachel had been the target of several in prior months. At 9:28 p.m., Tyler called Rachel while she navigated a curved section of the roadway. The recovered in-vehicle audio captured Tyler's 9:28 call, in which he described a supposed fire at the clinic and claimed that animals were trapped inside. He added details referencing specific rooms and noises consistent with rattled equipment. Investigators determined these details were fabricated based on interviews and facility records. Rachel's vehicle movements immediately after the call suggested an urgent attempt to turn around. GPS and skid analysis showed she decreased speed abruptly, pulled partially onto a dirt shoulder, and began maneuvering into a tight turning radius. Soil impressions indicated that the narrow, unreinforced shoulder, softened by recent rainfall, collapsed under the right side wheels, shifting the vehicle downhill. Tire marks showed she attempted to steer back toward the roadway, but frost on the pavement limited traction. The vehicle slid sideways, passed over a deteriorated edge of the shoulder, and descended a steep slope. Reconstruction specialists estimated an uncontrolled slide of roughly 80 feet through trees before the vehicle struck a large trunk at the base of the ravine. Rachel did not answer Tyler's later calls. Phone logs showed several redial attempts from Tyler beginning at 9:33 p.m., all of which went unanswered after the crash. At approximately 9:45 p.m., he drove along her route and saw displaced soil and bent railing consistent with a recent vehicle departure from the roadway. Emergency services were contacted at 9:47 p.m. Local responders arrived at 10:15 p.m. after navigating the narrow access road. Crews used lighting and rope systems to reach the crash site and found the vehicle heavily damaged on the driver's side. Rachel showed no signs of life, and medical personnel transported her to the nearest medical facility, where she was formally pronounced deceased. The medical examination determined that Rachel sustained fatal trauma to the head and torso, consistent with multiple high-force impacts during the descent. Analysis of the interior cabin, seatbelt marks, and deformation patterns supported these findings. The subsequent investigation concluded that Rachel's rapid attempt to reverse direction was triggered by the information provided during Tyler's call. Evidence supporting this included the recovered call recording abrupt vehicle speed changes, and the turning maneuver executed at a location not typically used for safe turnaround. Interviews, digital evidence, and facility records confirmed no emergency had occurred at the clinic. Tyler was later charged with negligent homicide and reckless endangerment based on his role in prompting the hazardous maneuver. Rachel Martinez's death showed how an invented crisis delivered at the wrong moment on an unstable road can create conditions where even a cautious driver has no opportunity to recover. It was October 8, 2018, in a remote alpine region of the northern mountains. Temperatures hovered near 41 degrees under shifting clouds, and intermittent light rain created slippery conditions on the narrow, high-elevation trail that wound between steep drop-offs and loose rock. Sarah Kim, 26, had planned a short overnight trip to photograph autumn colors in the surrounding basins. Friends later told investigators she often completed solo hikes and typically carried standard backcountry equipment, including spray deterrent and food storage gear. Device logs confirmed she began her approach shortly after sunrise, moving steadily along the established route. 28-year-old Michael Reyes joined her for the trip. Interviews indicated he occasionally accompanied friends on mountain trails and had expressed concern about Sarah traveling alone during peak wildlife movement. GPS data showed both hikers followed the same primary route toward a common saddle with gradual elevation gain. Throughout the morning, Sarah stopped to photograph weather shifts and vegetation, as confirmed by images recovered from her camera. The photos documented wet rock surfaces, heavy cloud patches, and limited visibility across the adjacent slope. The pair continued along the ridge, where the trail narrowed to sections no wider than 18 inches. At approximately 1:20 p.m., while navigating one of the exposed stretches, Michael initiated what he later described as a moment meant to tease Sarah. According to his statements and audio captured from Sarah's recording device, he pointed toward a small stand of trees ahead and claimed he had seen a bear. He also pulled lightly on her arm as he made the remark. Investigators concluded that Sarah reacted by shifting her weight backward while turning toward the direction Michael indicated. At that specific point, the trail bordered a steep drop, estimated at roughly 200 feet, into a rocky drainage basin. Soil analysis and ground impressions showed that the edge consisted of loose gravel, saturated by earlier rainfall. Evidence indicated Sarah's backward step landed on unstable material. The gravel gave way immediately, causing her to lose balance. Disturbance patterns on the slope, including displaced vegetation and scrape marks along exposed rock, mapped her descent down the steep incline. The path of disruption extended approximately 180 feet before coming to rest among boulders and fallen timber in the drainage below. Michael activated his locator beacon at 1:23 p.m. Device logs recorded several short-lived attempts by him to move downslope, but rescuers later determined the terrain in that area was too unstable for safe descent without technical equipment. Michael remained on the trail and monitored the location until responders arrived. Mountain rescue personnel received the alert at 1:25 p.m. Due to distance and terrain complexity, teams reached Michael's position at 4:15 p.m. Technical specialists rappelled into the drainage and located Sarah at 4:45 p.m. She showed no signs of life and was transported to a staging area before being taken to the nearest medical facility, where she was formally pronounced deceased. The medical examination determined that Sarah died from traumatic brain injury and internal bleeding, consistent with multiple high-force impacts during the fall. Investigators found no evidence of recent wildlife activity in the area. Interview statements, device data, and physical terrain markings supported the conclusion that the false wildlife warning initiated the movement that placed her on unstable ground. Sarah Kim's death demonstrated how a fabricated alert delivered on a narrow mountain trail with compromised footing can create conditions where a single misstep results in an unrecoverable fall. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.